In the year 1157, in the royal palace at Beaumont in Oxford, a child was born whose name would echo through the chronicles of Europe as both legend and paradox. Richard, the third legitimate son of King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, entered a world already turbulent with dynastic struggles, simmering rivalries, and a family fractured by ambition. His destiny was not that of a king. At his birth, few could have imagined he would inherit the crown, yet even from the beginning, the world around him seemed to conspire toward greatness, forging a character tempered by both privilege and conflict. Richard grew in the shadow of a father who was as cunning as he was ruthless, and a mother whose lands and influence stretched from the Pyrenees to the Loire. Eleanor was no ordinary queen. Once married to the King of France, she had divorced and wed Henry, bringing with her the vast and wealthy Duchy of Aquitaine. Richard would spend much of his youth there, not in the damp halls of England, but in the sun-soaked courts of southern France, where troubadours sang of chivalry and knights perfected their craft in tournaments. It was here that Richard absorbed the culture of courtly love, the fierce pride of the Aquitanian nobles, and a taste for independence that would shape his entire life. Unlike many royal sons, Richard was not content to remain under the shadow of his father. By the age of 15, he was already leading armies to suppress rebellious barons in Aquitaine, proving himself not merely as a figurehead, but as a commander of real skill and daring. His tall frame, commanding presence, and fiery courage made him instantly recognizable on the battlefield. He learned the art of war not in theory, but in the dust and blood of sieges and skirmishes. Aquitaine was a restless land, and the young duke, appointed by his mother, was forced to keep order by the sword. These experiences made him both feared and admired. Yet Richard's relationship with his father was anything but simple. Henry II was a master of power, a king who held more territory in France than the King of France himself. But his own sons rose against him one after another, in desperate bids for power. Richard, alongside his brothers Henry, the young king, and Geoffrey, was drawn into the endless web of rebellion. Time and again they defied their father, sometimes under the influence of Eleanor, who herself grew bitter at Henry's neglect and his mistresses. Richard's loyalty shifted like the tide, at once the obedient son and then the defiant prince. But in these betrayals, he learned the double-edged nature of politics, that ambition could be as sharp a weapon as any sword. Richard's youth was also marked by the shaping of his character in the ideals of knighthood. Though often depicted as a warrior above all else, he was no mere brute. He was a patron of troubadours, a composer of poetry, and a man who understood the power of spectacle. In the medieval world, a leader was not only measured by victories, but by the image he projected. Richard carefully crafted the persona of the perfect knight, fearless, noble, and unyielding in battle. It was an image that won him loyalty and awe, even from enemies who came to respect his courage. The deaths of his brothers altered his path forever. Henry the young king, once heir apparent, perished in 1183, leaving Richard as the most prominent surviving son. Geoffrey soon followed, killed in a tournament accident. With these tragedies, Richard suddenly stood in line for the English crown, a destiny he had not originally sought. But his father hesitated to confirm him as heir, still clinging to dreams of dividing his empire or favoring his youngest son, John. The conflict deepened, setting father against son in one of the most bitter rivalries in English history. By 1189, the tension reached its breaking point. Richard allied himself with King Philip II of France, his rival by birth, but his partner in rebellion. Together they pressed Henry to the edge, forcing him into submission. The old king, weary and ill, died shortly afterward, betrayed by those closest to him, including his beloved John. Richard inherited the crown in an atmosphere thick with both triumph and tragedy. He was now King of England, Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, and Duke of Aquitaine. Yet for all these titles, England itself was little more than a source of revenue to him. His heart belonged to the lands of France and to the battlefield where his true calling awaited. Richard's coronation in Westminster Abbey in September 1189 was a moment of grandeur, yet even this ceremony was overshadowed by turmoil. Violence erupted in London against the Jewish community, a bloody reminder of the prejudices that plagued medieval Europe. Richard, eager to assert his authority, condemned the riots, but the shadow of intolerance followed the age, staining the very day he became king. Barely had the crown touched his brow when Richard's eyes turned eastward. The Holy Land, seized by Saladin after the great victory at Hattin, had become the rallying cry of Christendom. Jerusalem had fallen, shocking Europe and igniting a new crusading fervor. Richard, molded by the ideals of knighthood and the romance of holy war, seized the cause with zeal. His first acts as king were not to settle into governance, but to raise funds, armies, and fleets. He sold offices, demanded contributions, and even declared that he would sell the city of London itself if he could find a buyer. His kingdom became a resource to fuel his greatest ambition, the journey to reclaim the Holy Sepulchre. Thus, Richard the Lionheart emerged not as a monarch content to rule from the throne, but as a warrior king whose true kingdom was the battlefield. His reign would be defined less by laws and councils, and more by the thunder of hooves, the clash of steel, and the banners of crusading armies marching toward the rising sun. His story was only beginning, a tale of courage, contradictions, and the pursuit of glory that would etch his name forever into the annals of history. The year was 1190, and Europe was alive with the call of crusade. Trumpets echoed in marketplaces, preachers roused the faithful, and the image of Jerusalem, once the prize of Christendom, now held firmly in the grip of Saladin, burned in the minds of nobles and peasants alike. Richard, crowned only months earlier, wasted no time in preparing to lead one of the greatest expeditions of the age. For him, kingship was not to be defined by parchment or policy, but by the clash of armies and the recapture of a holy city. Yet before he could set foot on the path to Jerusalem, the new king had to forge alliances, navigate rivalries, and gather the immense resources required for such an endeavor. His treasury was filled not by careful governance, but by relentless sale. Offices were auctioned, lands leased, privileges granted at a price. Nobles and churchmen alike were compelled to contribute. Nothing, Richard declared, was sacred except the mission itself. To his critics, it was extortion. To Richard, it was necessity. The crusade was not his alone. Across the Channel, Philip II of France, once Richard's ally against his father, was now both partner and rival. Their kingdoms, bound together in feudal complexity, were riddled with tensions. Yet both kings swore to take the cross, their uneasy alliance sealed by oath. A third monarch, the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, also answered the call, raising a vast host from Germany. It seemed for a brief moment as if Christendom's greatest powers might march united, but fate would intervene, reshaping the course of the crusade. Frederick, a man already legendary in his own right, set out across the Balkans with his immense army. Yet in the mountains of Anatolia, tragedy struck. The emperor drowned while crossing a river, and with his death, the German crusade dissolved into disarray. Many turned back, others pressed on, but the force that might have crushed Saladin in one mighty blow was reduced to fragments. Now the burden of leadership fell squarely on the shoulders of Richard and Philip. Richard's journey began not with glory, but with a storm. Setting sail from Dartmouth in the summer of 1190, his fleet braved the waters of the Bay of Biscay, making its way toward the Mediterranean. The seas, however, were no friend to the Crusaders. A tempest scattered his ships, some wrecked upon foreign shores. Survivors were captured or killed, their treasures plundered. Already the risks of the venture were clear. The fleet regrouped in Marseille where Richard met Philip, but their alliance soon showed signs of strain. The two kings traveled together along the coast, yet suspicion simmered between them. Richard's charisma, his towering presence, and his ability to command loyalty drew men to his banner in droves. Philip, shrewd and calculating, resented being overshadowed. Though united in purpose, their rivalry would follow them to the very gates of Jerusalem. From Marseille, Richard's fleet made its way to Sicily. There the politics of southern Italy entangled the Crusaders in disputes not of the Holy Land, but of Europe itself. King William II of Sicily had died, leaving his throne contested. Richard's sister, Joan, widow of the late king, was held captive by the new ruler Tancred. Outraged, Richard demanded her release and a share of her inheritance. Tensions escalated, and in typical fashion Richard turned not to diplomacy but to force. His troops stormed the city of Messina, seizing it and compelling Tancred to negotiate. By the winter of 1190, Richard had secured Joan's freedom and a sizable payment. It was a display of power that reminded all who watched that the Lionheart was not merely a pilgrim, but a conqueror. Yet Sicily also became the stage for another drama, one that would shape the crusade. Richard had been betrothed to Alice, Philip's sister, for many years, but he had no desire to marry her. Instead, his heart, or perhaps his strategy, led him toward Berengaria of Navarre, daughter of King Sancho VI. Their union would bring valuable alliances in Spain and strengthen Richard's position in Aquitaine. In the spring of 1191, as Richard prepared to depart Sicily, Berengaria arrived. On the island of Cyprus, she would become his wife, cementing a marriage that, while never producing heirs, bound their names in history. The island of Cyprus, however, was not merely a place for celebration. It was the next chapter in Richard's campaign of conquest. Shipwrecked vessels of his fleet had landed on its shores where their crews were seized by Isaac Komnenos, the Byzantine ruler of the island who had declared himself independent. Richard, enraged at the mistreatment of his men, launched an assault. His army swept across Cyprus with ferocious efficiency, defeating Isaac and claiming the island for himself. In a matter of weeks, Richard had transformed a setback into a triumph. Cyprus, rich and strategically vital, would remain in Crusader hands for centuries. It was here, amid the conquest, that Richard married Berengaria, in a ceremony that combined political calculation with the pageantry of romance. For the Lionheart, love and war walked hand in hand, each feeding his legend. His conquest of Cyprus not only gave him a secure base for his fleet, but also sent a clear message to friend and foe alike. Wherever Richard went, victory followed. By the summer of 1191, the crusade had reached its true theatre. Richard and Philip landed at Acre, a city that had become the focal point of the struggle between Christian and Muslim forces. For nearly 2 years, Crusader armies had besieged the city, but it remained in Muslim hands. The arrival of the two kings transformed the balance. Richard, despite suffering from illness, threw himself into the siege with relentless vigor. Siege engines hurled stones against the walls, miners worked to undermine the defenses, and the Crusaders pressed their assault. At last, Acre fell. The capture of Acre was both a triumph and a turning point. Within its walls lay the captured banner of Saladin, torn down by Richard himself as a symbol of victory. Yet the aftermath revealed the darker side of crusading warfare. Thousands of Muslim prisoners, including women and children, were held within the city. Negotiations with Saladin faltered, and when terms were not met, Richard ordered the mass execution of the captives. It was an act both ruthless and calculated, intended to demonstrate his resolve and strike fear into his enemies. To his contemporaries, it was both a stain and a testament to his ferocity. As Acre fell, so too did the fragile alliance between Richard and Philip. The French king, weary of illness and overshadowed by Richard's dominance, soon announced his departure for home. Though he promised to support the crusade from afar, his absence left Richard as the undisputed leader of the expedition. For better or worse, the Lionheart now stood alone at the head of Christendom's greatest army. Ahead lay the hardest road of all, the march south toward Jerusalem, across the parched plains and fortified strongholds of the Levant. Saladin, the master of strategy and symbol of Muslim unity, awaited him. Two titans of their age, destined to clash in battles that would resound across centuries, were about to meet face to face. The fall of Acre marked the beginning, not the end, of Richard's great trial. With the city secured, his army prepared to march south along the coast of Palestine, each step bringing them closer to Jerusalem. Yet the road ahead was far from easy. Saladin, the master of strategy, knew that confronting the Crusaders in open battle could be disastrous. Instead, he shadowed their advance, striking where the terrain favored him, harassing supply lines, and waiting for the moment when weariness and heat would weaken the invaders. Richard understood this game well. His own genius as a commander shone not only in moments of glory but in discipline. He knew the crusading host was vast, filled with knights from every corner of Europe, but also with quarrelsome barons, mercenaries, and pilgrims. Disorder was their greatest enemy, and he drilled them with iron resolve. The army marched in formation, the sea always at their right, ships sailing in parallel to provide supplies and water. Knights rode not in reckless charges, but in ordered ranks, ready to respond at a signal. Day after day arrows rained from the hills, cavalry darted in and out, yet Richard held his line, turning the march itself into a display of precision. Saladin sought to break that discipline at every opportunity. His mounted archers, swift and deadly, loosed clouds of arrows, killing men and horses, straining the Crusaders' patience. The heat of the Levant sun baked armor and sapped strength. Disease lurked in every camp, and the soldiers' minds wandered to the holy city that lay just beyond their reach. It was under such constant torment that the mettle of the Lionheart was revealed. He rode among his men, rallying them, his presence a constant reassurance. His enemies, too, took note. Saladin's chroniclers, though bitter in defeat, spoke of Richard's courage with a respect seldom granted to an adversary. At last, the tension erupted at Arsuf. On the 7th of September 1191, the Crusaders marched south of Haifa, their column stretched along the coast. Saladin struck with all his might, unleashing his cavalry in relentless waves. The rearguard, made up of the Knights Hospitaller, bore the brunt of the assault, their formation shaken by repeated charges. For hours they endured, but the strain grew unbearable. Against Richard's orders, the Hospitallers broke ranks and charged. It might have been disaster. Yet in that instant Richard seized the moment with masterful instinct. Instead of chastising the premature attack, he sounded the call for a general charge. Trumpets blared, and the Crusader cavalry, pent up after days of restraint, surged forward like a tidal wave. Lances lowered, banners snapping in the wind. They crashed into Saladin's forces with irresistible force. The battlefield erupted in chaos as Muslim cavalry reeled under the impact. Their formations shattered. Richard himself rode at the center, a towering figure clad in gleaming mail, striking fear into those who dared to face him. The rout was decisive. Saladin's army, though not destroyed, was forced to retreat in disarray. Arsuf became a testament to Richard's brilliance, not merely as a warrior, but as a leader who knew when to harness discipline and when to unleash fury. The victory electrified the crusading host. For the first time, Saladin had been beaten decisively in the field. The road to Jerusalem seemed open, and Richard's name became a rallying cry throughout Christendom. Yet victory brought not clarity, but dilemma. To march on Jerusalem required not only courage but logistics, supplies, reinforcements, secure lines of communication. The holy city lay inland, far from the sea, where Saladin's cavalry could cut the Crusaders off from food and water. Richard understood this better than most. His council debated furiously, some urging an immediate strike, others cautioning patience. Richard weighed the risks, knowing that a failed assault could spell the end of the crusade entirely. Twice the army advanced toward Jerusalem, and twice it turned back, the king refusing to gamble his men's lives on uncertain odds. This hesitation earned him criticism. To many, the crusade was about Jerusalem itself, not victories on the coast or captured cities like Jaffa and Ascalon. Pilgrims yearned to kneel at the Holy Sepulchre, and nobles hungered for the glory of conquest. But Richard's genius lay in his pragmatism. He knew Saladin could not be crushed by reckless valor alone. The struggle was not only about walls and gates, but about endurance, about who could sustain the fight longest in the unforgiving climate of the East. Even in these moments of caution, Richard's reputation grew. He fortified the coastal cities, ensuring that the Crusaders held a chain of strongholds to anchor their presence. He repelled sudden strikes with brilliance, none more dramatic than at Jaffa in 1192, when Saladin launched a surprise assault on the city. Richard, arriving by sea with only a handful of knights, rallied the defenders and led a counterattack that drove Saladin's forces from the walls. Chroniclers marveled at his courage, recording how he fought tirelessly from dawn to dusk, sword flashing, his voice carrying over the din of battle. Saladin himself, it was said, could not help but admire the king's indomitable spirit. The two men, so different in faith and background, came to respect one another deeply. Saladin, a devout Muslim, admired Richard's chivalry and the discipline he commanded. Richard, though fierce in war, recognized in Saladin a worthy opponent, one who embodied the same ideals of honor and leadership. Stories spread of courtesies exchanged, of Saladin sending fruit and snow to cool Richard's fever, of Richard returning gestures of goodwill. Though the war between them was merciless, it carried a strange undertone of mutual recognition, as if each saw in the other a reflection of the qualities that defined their age. The stalemate dragged on, wearing down both sides. Richard longed to press forward, but the politics of Europe weighed heavily upon him. News reached him of his brother John scheming in England, of Philip of France encroaching on his territories. Each day spent in the Holy Land risked the unravelling of his kingdom at home. His heart was torn between the holy cause and the crown he had barely begun to wear. At last, in 1192, the inevitable came. Unable to seize Jerusalem, yet unwilling to abandon the crusade in defeat, Richard sought peace. Negotiations with Saladin produced a truce. Jerusalem would remain in Muslim hands, but Christian pilgrims would be granted safe passage to the holy sites. The coastal cities would remain in Crusader control, ensuring a foothold for future expeditions. It was not the triumph of the cross over the crescent, but it was a compromise that spared further bloodshed. Richard's departure was tinged with both glory and regret. He had carved victories from the desert sands, humbled Saladin in battle, and upheld the ideal of the knightly king. Yet Jerusalem remained beyond his grasp, a prize that eluded even the Lionheart. His reputation, however, did not suffer. Across Europe, he was hailed as the embodiment of chivalry, the warrior monarch whose name alone struck awe into friend and foe alike. As his ships turned westward, Richard knew his trials were far from over. The road home would prove as perilous as any battlefield, and the enemies awaiting him in Europe would test him in ways even Saladin could not. The year was 1192, and the crusade had reached its uneasy conclusion. Richard the Lionheart, though hailed as the great champion of Christendom, departed the Holy Land with unfinished business. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands, secured by Saladin's strength and diplomacy. The truce had preserved Christian access to the holy places, yet for many it was an unsatisfying end. Still, Richard's reputation stood undiminished. He had fought with valor, outmaneuvered one of the greatest leaders of the age, and carved his name into legend. But the Lionheart's greatest trial was still ahead, for the path home was fraught with danger. Richard could not return directly to England. His old ally turned rival, Philip of France, had already hurried back to Europe. Once there, Philip began to chip away at Richard's lands in Normandy and plot with Richard's brother John. Every mile Richard travelled was shadowed by intrigue, for enemies lay in wait. To cross openly would invite ambush. To return secretly was the only option. He left by ship, but storms drove his vessel off course. Forced to land near the Adriatic, Richard began a long and treacherous journey overland, moving in disguise, often with only a handful of companions. But his identity was impossible to conceal for long. His height, his bearing, and his fame made him a marked man. In Vienna, the trap was sprung. Duke Leopold of Austria, nursing a bitter grudge from the crusade, captured him. It was said Leopold had not forgotten Richard's insult at Acre, where the Lionheart had torn down his banner from the city walls. Now the Duke had in his grasp the very man who had humiliated him. Richard was a prize too valuable to keep for himself. He was handed over to the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI, who saw in him not only a fortune, but a means of asserting imperial power over the kings of Europe. Word spread across Christendom with shock and outrage. The King of England, hero of the crusade, was a prisoner, shackled in a foreign dungeon. For a monarch to be held captive was a scandal, an insult to the sacred nature of kingship itself. Yet for Henry it was an opportunity. He set Richard's ransom at a staggering sum, 150,000 marks of silver, a fortune so vast it seemed impossible to raise. Back in England, the demand sent shockwaves through the realm. The sum was nearly 3 times the annual revenue of the crown. To pay it required extraordinary measures, a tax levied on every household, the confiscation of treasures from churches, and contributions demanded from nobles and commoners alike. Priests stripped their altars of gold and silver, farmers surrendered their coin, nobles pledged their fortunes. Never before had such a ransom been raised, and never again would a people bear such a burden for their king. It was said that 2/3 of every Englishman's annual income was claimed to free him, but while England bled silver for its king, not all rejoiced at his plight. John, Richard's younger brother, saw opportunity in his absence. Ambitious and scheming, John allied himself with Philip of France, offering loyalty in exchange for support against his captive brother. Together they sought to carve up Richard's lands and power. Philip sent word to Henry VI, urging him to keep Richard imprisoned indefinitely. "The devil is loose," he declared, when he learned of Richard's impending release, a phrase that captured the fear and resentment Richard inspired in his rivals. Meanwhile, in his captivity, Richard proved as indomitable as ever. Tales spread of how he composed songs to pass the time, his voice echoing from the walls of his prison. Legends grew that he sent secret messages through his verses, reaching his loyal followers beyond the bars. Whether truth or myth, the image of the captive king singing in defiance only burnished his legend further. At last, through sacrifice and relentless effort, the ransom was raised. In 1194, after more than a year in chains, Richard the Lionheart walked free. His return was not quiet or subdued, but triumphant. Crowds gathered, bells rang, and the realm erupted in celebration. The king, whose people had paid so dearly for his freedom, was once again among them. Yet Richard's thoughts did not linger on gratitude or rest. His eyes turned immediately to vengeance and war, for while he languished in captivity, his enemies had moved boldly. Philip had taken castles in Normandy. John had tried to usurp his throne. Now Richard returned with a fury sharpened by betrayal. He declared John forgiven, for political necessity outweighed personal anger. But the message was clear. The Lionheart was back, and those who had doubted him would soon regret it. In the months that followed, Richard threw himself into the struggle against France with the same vigor he had shown in the Holy Land. Campaigns swept across Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine as castles fell and armies clashed. Richard's genius for siegecraft and tactics again shone brightly. His enemies had thought him broken by captivity, but instead he returned more determined than ever to defend his realm and his honor. The ransom, though ruinous, had cemented Richard's place in history. No king before or after had been valued so highly, no people had sacrificed so much to redeem their sovereign. His captivity, far from diminishing his legend, had magnified it. He was now not only a crusader king but a martyr of sorts, one whose chains had been struck off by the devotion of his people. The Lionheart had been caged, but never tamed. Yet even as he waged war in France, Richard knew that time was against him. The crown he had worn for less than a decade was a burden heavy with conflict, and his enemies were many. Still he pressed on, driven by the same restless spirit that had carried him from the courts of Aquitaine to the deserts of Palestine. Every battle fought, every wall stormed, every plot unraveled, added to the story of a king who seemed more warrior than ruler, more legend than man. The tale of his capture and ransom revealed much of Richard's essence. He was reckless, perhaps, in journeying home through hostile lands. He was proud, even arrogant, in the way he treated allies who later became enemies. Yet his courage, his charisma, and his indomitable will inspired such loyalty that a kingdom impoverished itself to bring him back. Few leaders in history could command such devotion, and fewer still could emerge from chains to stride once more onto the battlefield with undimmed glory. But fate, as ever, had the final word. Richard's story did not end in captivity, nor in the courts of England, but back where it had begun, in the relentless theatre of war. His last years would be spent in the clash of swords and the thunder of siege engines, until death claimed the warrior king not in the east, but in the heart of his own domains. By the spring of 1199, Richard the Lionheart, though weary from years of war and travel, remained a force of unmatched ferocity. His kingdom, though scarred by taxation and rebellion, was secure under his iron will. Yet his restless spirit refused to stay confined to court or castle. The lands he had inherited, Anjou, Normandy, Aquitaine, were under constant threat from Philip II of France, a monarch as cunning as he was ambitious. Philip's designs on Richard's territories were relentless, exploiting any weakness, while Richard, ever the soldier, prepared to meet him with sword in hand. Richard's campaigns in France were swift and merciless. He moved from castle to castle, lifting sieges, routing enemies, and using both diplomacy and terror to maintain loyalty. Towns that had wavered returned to obedience when faced with the Lionheart's reputation for both justice and ruthlessness. He was relentless, leading charges himself, testing bridges, scaling walls, and inspiring men with a presence that made fear and devotion inseparable. Even the most seasoned knights, hardened by decades of European warfare, marveled at his energy and audacity. His campaigns were not merely military maneuvers. They were a demonstration of dominance, a living testament to the legend he had become. Yet in the spring of 1199, fate intervened in a manner as unexpected as it was fatal. In the small castle of Châlus-Chabrol, in the Limousin region of France, Richard was conducting a siege against a minor stronghold held by rebellious vassals. He had underestimated the dangers of such a small fortress, and as he inspected the fortifications, a crossbow bolt struck him in the shoulder. The wound, seemingly minor at first, festered quickly. Medieval medicine, limited and often primitive, could not halt the infection that spread. The great warrior, the Lionheart who had faced armies without fear, found himself at the mercy of a humble wound. In the days that followed, Richard's condition worsened. Despite the efforts of surgeons and the prayers of his men, gangrene took hold. He faced the end with the same courage that had defined his life. There were no moments of despair recorded, only commands for his army to continue, for his allies to maintain loyalty, and for his men to remember the victories they had won together. Even in death, he was a commander, a leader, a king whose presence could not be diminished. Richard's passing on April 6, 1199, marked the end of an era. His body was returned to Fontevraud Abbey, where it would rest alongside his parents and ancestors, a solemn reminder of the power and perils of royalty. Yet even in death, his legend refused to fade. Across Europe, tales circulated of his bravery, his mercy, his ruthlessness, and his enduring charisma. He had been both feared and adored, a man whose very name could command armies, inspire poets, and instill awe in friend and foe alike. The aftermath of his death revealed the precarious balance he had maintained in life. His brother John inherited the English crown, a ruler far less capable and far more treacherous. Philip II of France seized the opportunity to expand his influence, reclaiming territories that Richard had fought so hard to defend. The Lionheart's empire, vast and interconnected, began to fragment without the force of his personality to hold it together. Yet even as borders shifted and castles changed hands, the memory of Richard endured. He became a symbol of courage, chivalry, and martial genius, a figure larger than life who would be immortalized in song, story, and legend. Richard's military brilliance lay not only in his personal courage, but in his understanding of strategy and logistics. From the fields of Normandy to the deserts of the Levant, he demonstrated an uncanny ability to inspire troops, coordinate complex maneuvers, and exploit the weaknesses of his enemies. He combined intellect with instinct, planning with improvisation, and a relentless drive with a deep awareness of morale and human behavior. No battlefield was too large, no enemy too formidable, no obstacle too great to test the limits of his skill. Yet Richard was also a man of paradox. He could be generous and cruel, merciful and merciless, devoted to his ideals yet reckless in pursuit of them. His life was defined by extremes, the serene courts of Aquitaine contrasted with the bloodied sands of Acre, moments of love and devotion intertwined with acts of war and vengeance. This complexity is what made him legendary. He was not merely a warrior. He was a living embodiment of the contradictions of his age, a night king whose deeds transcended the ordinary and entered the realm of myth. The Lionheart's legacy would echo far beyond the years of his reign. In England, he became the archetype of the chivalric king, the soldier above all else, inspiring generations of knights and rulers. In France, he was both a rival and a legend, shaping the ambitions of Philip II and subsequent monarchs. In the Middle East, Saladin's respect for Richard ensured that his reputation crossed religious and cultural boundaries, a recognition that courage and honor are universally acknowledged. Even centuries later, historians, poets, and storytellers would recount his campaigns, his daring exploits, and his larger-than-life presence, ensuring that Richard remained forever in the imagination of Europe and the world. But perhaps the most enduring aspect of Richard the Lionheart was the image he projected, the perfect synthesis of warrior and king. He inspired devotion among men who fought under him, admiration among allies and fear among enemies. He understood that leadership was as much about perception as action, that a sword in hand and a steady gaze could achieve what laws and treaties often could not. He built a legend in life that neither death nor time could diminish, a name that would become synonymous with courage, ambition, and indomitable will. Even as the centuries passed, Richard's story remained a touchstone for understanding the medieval world, the ambitions of kings, the realities of warfare, the ideals of chivalry, and the human capacity for courage and folly. From the sun-baked sands of Palestine to the rain-soaked castles of France, the Lionheart's presence left an indelible mark. He was a man of his time, yet his life transcended it, reminding all who would listen that history is often shaped not only by events, but by the men and women who seize destiny with courage and conviction. Richard the Lionheart, king, warrior, and legend, may have fallen to a crossbow bolt at Chalus, yet his spirit endured in the memory of the world he had sought to conquer and defend. His life was a testament to the heights of ambition, the ferocity of war, and the enduring power of human courage. He had lived as few men could dream, fought as few men dared, and left behind a legacy that time itself could not erase. The Lionheart, in all his contradictions and grandeur, became eternal, not simply as a king of England, but as a symbol of martial greatness, a hero of legend whose story would resonate across the centuries.